Good morning and welcome to this WIOA webinar. My name is Scott Shook with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar. As a reminder, all participants on the call are in mute mode. Please use the raise your hand function in the webinar if you'd like to speak, or if you have any questions, please place your questions in the question box for the presenters. Documents for today's meeting can be downloaded in the handouts area of this webinar. The webinar will be recorded and be available on the Illinois workNet usually within the next 48 hours. With that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Bethany Yeager, who will be our presenter for today.
Thank you, Scott. Good morning. This is Bethany Yeager with KEB. We help facilitate the interagency leadership team and the interagency technical assistance team that helped develop these governor's guidelines. Today's webinar is to highlight the advanced release version of the governor's guidelines, revision 4. The advanced release guidelines were actually issued on November 20th last month. That included the governor's guidelines, the narrative, which includes the actual guidance, the MOU template, the one-stop operating budget spreadsheet, and all of the other forms that make up the governor's guidelines in the appendices. So the issuance of this advanced release version replaces all previous guidance and is now the authoritative source going forward. So we were last before you on October 16th, and we presented the draft revisions to the governor's guidelines, revision 4, and we sought your feedback about those draft revisions. We thank you to all who voiced their feedback or submitted questions after the October 16th webinar, because your questions helped us develop responses, and they've been posted on the WIOA implementation portal in what we've come to call the frequently asked questions. We update that periodically so that any questions that come in can be addressed in writing and posted for all to see. So we are going to go through some of those frequently asked questions during today's webinar so you can see how your questions were incorporated into the governor's guidelines revision 4 that was released last month. And just as a reminder, all of the forms and the FAQ are all posted on the WIOA implementation portal. The link is on the screen, and it's also going to be incorporated throughout some additional screens today. If you have any questions about where to find the WIOA implementation portal, just let us know and we can guide you there. All of the forms are available on that portal. They are unlocked so that you can edit those forms and you can fix any formatting issues that cause you grief as you proceed with your PY20, program year 2020 negotiations for MOUs and the one-stop operating budgets. So with that, I'll begin with highlighting what this means when we say advanced release. So this is the language that you see atop the Governor's Guidelines Revision 4 narrative. And this advanced release language simply means that the Governor's Guidelines are pending final approval from the Governor's office. So the guidelines are not anticipated to change, and you're strongly encouraged to begin your planning and your MOU negotiations for program year 2020 as outlined in the Governor's Guidelines. So in other words, don't wait for the final version of the Governor's Guidelines Revision 4 to be issued before you begin coordinating the MOU and budget negotiation process. This first form, as we'll talk about today, is due before January 1st to help make sure your negotiations start off on a solid footing. So don't wait. Then what I thought we would do during today's webinar is, again, provide some background just in case anyone is new to the Governor's Guidelines or MOU negotiations. Then we're going to describe specifically how the feedback that you provided about the draft version of the guidelines were incorporated. And I'll go over both the revisions to the revisions to the Governor's Guidelines narrative and also revisions to the MOU template. And then we'll highlight other resources that are available in the Governor's Guidelines, and they really can be helpful to you, particularly with terms and timelines and other templates that are provided to you to support you in your negotiations leading up to program year 2020. So we'll also remind you of the timeline, which is the same as in previous years. So that's hopefully that's helpful to you to follow the same timeline. And we'll end this webinar by reminding you about the first form that's due by January 1st. And I am going to pause throughout the presentation to ask if you have any questions. We'll respond to whatever we can today. If there's something I can't answer for any reason, we will ask if other required partners who are on the phone can address the question directly, or we will just get back to you and add your questions to the frequently asked questions that are written responses from the required partners, so that we can make sure that we close the loop on whatever questions we couldn't answer. So first, as you know, this is the background. WIOA requires the governor to issue guidelines for how all of the required partners under WIOA at the state and local levels should navigate the negotiation process. And that negotiation is about how partners are going to deliver services and share the costs of the local workforce system. So as you know, the environment for this year's guidance is a little bit different than in the past couple of years, simply because MOUs span 3 years. That means the current MOUs for PY 2019 are going to expire by June 30. So program year 2020 on July 1st, 2020 starts a new term of new MOUs. So all MOUs are going to be renegotiated this coming program, or leading up to this program year. And those MOUs span 3 years, so that'll take you out to 2023. But the infrastructure funding agreements and the one-stop operating budgets still have to be negotiated every single year. They are annual and require you to amend the agreed upon budget to the MOU each year. So that's just again reminding you of the timeframes of each document. The governor's guidelines themselves have been updated multiple times since they were originally issued in 2015. And what's on the left side of your screen is explaining what we mean by revisions and kind of tracing our steps for how we got to revision 4. Most of the revisions to the governor's guidelines have been a reaction to new federal guidance. For example, when the feds issued new guidance about infrastructure funding requirements, also applying to affiliate centers, that required a revision to the guidelines that were offered to you about how to negotiate shared costs for infrastructure funding, infrastructure of the one-stop operating centers. The supplemental guidance is another form of guidance that's been issued to you periodically in the last few years. Those typically were, as described on the right side of the screen, when the main body of the guidelines did not change, but there was information that was very specific and necessary for a particular program year. For example, when that federal guidance came out about affiliate centers and designated affiliate centers being under the same requirements as comprehensive one-stop centers for infrastructure funding requirements, we knew that we had to issue a new budget spreadsheet. And so there was additional guidance, and a new budget spreadsheet was issued to you as a supplement to the existing governor's guidelines. That gets us up to last year. Revision 3 last November focused on bringing all of the supplemental guidance and all of any informal guidance that was issued into one document. And so that was hopefully a more user-friendly document. You had one place to go rather than 5 different places to go. And last year also one new form was issued to try to help make sure that your negotiations again started off on a solid footing with all partners participating in the negotiation period from the beginning. And that form that was new last year, that is repeated this year, is called the pre-program year planning form, which I will go over here shortly in the webinar. So revision 4, as a reminder, was developed by considering 3 things that are described on the slide. The first was an annual survey seeking feedback about how your PY program year 2019 negotiations went. Did you run into any trouble? Was the guidance helpful? What feedback do you have about the negotiations? We also considered an analysis of where the local areas in the MOUs have struggled to comply with the regulations or be specific enough in their MOUs to be meaningful about how the partners are going to deliver services or share costs. So the Interagency Technical Assistance team asked, where were the trouble spots and how can the guidance be clarified or streamlined to help alleviate those trouble spots? So we also consulted with the IWIB Executive Committee and the IWIB Service Integration Work Group, or what's also called the Radical Candor, to think about how the MOU can build on and not repeat the service integration action plans that you all filled out for the first time this year. So the MOU is intended to be an advancement or the way that you'll operationalize those service integration action plans. And we wanted to talk through how that would work in the actual guidance. And we got their feedback and incorporated that into the Governor's Guidelines Revision 4 and into the MOU template. The other set of revisions that are described on the screen is that in the survey feedback, the large majority of you said try to reduce redundancies, streamline, and clarify where content really just cause unnecessary work or unnecessary content and large paragraphs of text in your MOU template. So we did our best to try to alleviate that in the revision 4. So that feedback really did provide an opportunity to learn from your experiences over the past 4 years since WIOA was enacted. And there really were 3 approaches to the revisions that came out of your feedback. One is, where can the governor's guidelines be streamlined so that local areas are not repeating content between your regional plans and your local plans and your MOUs and the service integration action plans. As I said in the last webinar, the last thing the technical assistance team or any other partner wants is to play gotcha by comparing documents and finding inconsistencies just because the guidance was written in different ways. We want to avoid that. That's unnecessary. The other approach to a revision is that we asked, where could the guidance be clearer so that, one, you're all very clear with each other as required partners, how you can be specific in your commitments that you're making to provide equal access to services throughout the local workforce system. And then how can the guidance make it more clear about what you need to do in order to comply with the regulations? And then the last approach to the changes in revision 4 were, where can the guidance be more user-friendly and help make the MOU a realistic document, and also make it clear how the MOU operationalizes the commitments that you made in regional and local plans and in your service integration action plans. The MOU, in other words, is where the rubber hits the road. And we need to make sure that the guidance acknowledges that and makes that a lot easy to achieve. So when we presented the draft governor's guidelines to you in October, many of you participated, thank you, and you asked questions. So your questions related to both the governor's guidelines narrative about the guidance for the negotiation process, and then some questions also were specific to the MOU template or any other forms that are part of the governor's guidelines. So we're going to now review some of those responses to the questions that you asked during and after the October 16th webinar, and we'll use the FAQ, or the frequently asked questions, to show you how the governor's guidelines addressed your questions about the narrative or the forms. So this is starting with the question about the governor's guidelines narrative and the negotiation process. There is a natural question to ask whether all partners are aware of the requirement to participate in good faith. That was one question that was submitted last time. As you see on the screen here, the Governor's Guidelines Revision 4 emphasized that this is a bit more with the yellow highlighted section of each participating and partner meetings from the beginning of the negotiation period. The Governor's Guidelines Revision 4 want to make sure and emphasize that all partners actually participate from the beginning of each negotiation period. That's intended to help address the issue of a partner who doesn't participate early and raises an issue at the very end of the negotiation process. That's not a negotiation. And we all know that. but we're trying to make sure in the governor's guidelines, it makes it very explicit that a partner can't just create a budget and consider it final for feedback without having a discussion and a true negotiation about that budget or any portion of the MOU template. There's also a rationale behind the new form called the pre-program year planning form. That the intent of the form is to set clear expectations up front in December each year before you begin your negotiations so that all partners have an opportunity to participate. You know the number of meetings, or at least the estimated number of meetings. You know the people who are going to be in the lead on the negotiations. So let's look at that form now. And I know you filled it out last year if you participated in the PY19 negotiations, but I'd like to just draw a couple of highlights from the form this year. The form is the same with just some very minor changes. And as a reminder, these forms are due by January 1st each year. So now really is the time to start the conversations and planning for the PY 2020 negotiations. Do not wait, as I said before. So note that the first question on the left page of the slide, that question is to ensure that all required partners in the local area are aware of the submitted contents of the form. To do so, the form must be circulated to all the required partners in advance and indicate the date by which all the preliminary budget will be shared with all the required partners. Note the identification of the key individuals, such as the MOU negotiator, the impartial budget negotiator, which can be the same person, and the individual responsible for conducting periodic reconciliation. On the second page, on the right side of the slide, we ask that you identify the frequency of reconciliation, and then you see a box for the proposed schedule of MOU and budget negotiations, including any dates, if you know them, about meetings for those negotiations. And if you don't know the exact dates, at least put what you do know about we expect 3 meetings or 2 meetings or whatever it is that fits your local area. And if you need examples of what others have submitted, please just let the technical assistance team know because we do have examples, and I believe we've posted some of those on the WIOA implementation portal about a best practice for how to fill out that form. What's new, as we identified on the October 16th webinar, and I'll repeat here, is that on the bottom of the right side of the screen, you see a checkbox. It's a simple thing, but the new checkbox is to indicate whether a new partner, program, or representative is new to the negotiation process and could benefit from a WIOA orientation. We know as people or positions change, sometimes someone is in a spot where they know they need to participate in the negotiations, but they may not have the background needed to fully participate or understand what's required of the partners. So if that's the case, check that box. Then the interagency technical assistance team knows that some outreach can be done to make sure that anyone who is new has the orientation they need and has all the resources they need to fully participate. This is slide are the last 2 pages of the pre-program year planning form that's due by January 1st. The left page asks you to list all the designated comprehensive one-step centers and all the non-designated connection or access sites in the local area. The pre-program year planning form is the only form where you have to identify all access sites. That helps all of the required partners understand the access sites in the whole local area, and it helps the interagency teams at the state level keep track of which centers might need to be included in the one-step operating budget if they're not already included. When we get to the MOU template and next, then I'll show you where you are only asked to identify the designated comprehensive one-step centers and designated affiliate or specialized centers in the MOU. So there's a little bit of a difference. In the pre-program year planning form, we ask you to identify all access sites. And in the MOU template, it's really focused on only the designated comprehensive one-stop centers and designated affiliate or specialized centers. And lastly, on the pre-program year planning form on the right side of the screen, The page shows you that you can request a waiver from a provision of the governor's guidelines that is within the state's control, if all partners agree that a waiver is warranted. So there's two ifs there. One is if the provision that you're asking for a waiver from is within the state's control. Obviously, the state can't give you a waiver to a federal requirement. And the other if is if all partners agree that a waiver is needed and warranted and agreed upon. So that if that's the case, then you can fill out this form and say, we think a waiver is needed, all the partners agree, here's a rationale, and then the local board chair has to submit the form to indicate that all partners agree to that waiver request. So it doesn't require a signature of all required partners, but it does require the local board chair to submit the form, and that is the indication that all the partners agree to the waiver request. So it needs to be part of your conversations early in the process if you plan to request a waiver at this point of negotiations leading up to January. You can request a waiver later in the program year or later in your negotiation process, but this pre-program year planning form provides it here just in case you already know, based on past experience or current conversation, that a waiver is needed for your local area. As I mentioned, the pre-program year planning form asks you to list all service locations or access sites, including those that are designated or not. Now the MOU template, that's what this screen is showing, is where you list only the designated comprehensive one-stop centers and designated affiliate or specialized centers. Those are the ones that have to be listed in this section of the MOU template and included in the one-stop operating budget, because those are the ones, the designated sites are the ones where the infrastructure funding requirements apply. And when I say infrastructure funding requirements, we mean, of course, that all required partners must make their services available and support and share in the cost of the services of running those designated comprehensive one-stop centers, designated affiliate or specialized centers. I'll finish going through the FAQ and then I'll pause for any questions you have about what we presented so far. This question is one that came in during the October 16th webinar, and it says, who's responsible for overseeing the negotiations process regarding formal cross-training arrangements and fulfillment of those commitments? The governor's guidelines do provide a section that's highlighted on the right side of your screen that says the one-stop operator may be a source for cross-trained staff, but ultimately there's no regulation that really says someone is responsible for ensuring formal cross-training. So the way that the governor's guidelines treat it is that it's really up to the required partners to negotiate how services will be provided and who's going to provide them, whether that's on-site or cross-training or direct linkage. So it's really ultimately up to the required partners to identify how cross-training is going to happen. This question is specific to the governor's guidelines narrative and the actual negotiation process. So it says, can the state require a local area to provide a call-in option for MOU and budget negotiations to avoid potential scheduling conflicts? Well, what might be we understand the final rules specify that the MOU has to be a product of good faith negotiations, but it doesn't stipulate how those negotiations need to happen, whether they can happen in person or by phone or video or whatever method you use. It's really up to the local partners. What's underlying this question is probably a frustration over some required partners not being responsive or hard to reach for MOU negotiation meetings. Our advice in that situation is to contact the interagency technical assistance team, tell us which partner is hard to reach, and then the state level technical assistance team partners can elevate the issue to any state level administrator if it's a state administered program, or DOL if it's a federal contractor, or any other representative, program representative, to ensure that the designated individual in your local area is identified and contacted so they at least have every opportunity to participate in the MOU negotiations. So again, we just offer the interagency technical assistance team as trying to help you troubleshoot any absentee required partner in the beginning of your negotiation process or at any time throughout the process. This question is about an item of required content in the MOU template, and it relates to the one-stop operator model. What are the prescribed functions of the one-stop operator that they cannot perform? The prescribed functions in the one-stop operator are actually specified in the regulations, and there's the citation there on the screen. It's also specified in the MOU template. You can see a snapshot of the MOU template on the right. Those checkboxes on the bottom half of the screen are new this year in the MOU template, and an attempt to make it streamlined for you to remove the perfunctory paragraphs that were included in the last MOU template, and instead replace them with checkboxes to simply show that by checking these boxes, all required partners agree and affirm that the one-stop operator will not perform any of the functions that are specified in the regulations of WIOA. These functions are simply to help avoid a conflict of interest. And by checking those boxes, you all agree that the one-stop operator will not participate in anything that would be a conflict of interest. This is another question about the one-stop operator. Does the one-stop operator model selected by the local area, for example, a consortium model or a single entity, affect the activities that are prohibited from being performed by the one-stop operator? And the answer is clearly no. All of those prohibited functions that are specified in the regulations apply regardless of the model selected by the local area. Just a few more questions, and then I'll pause. This question relates to the MOU template section about physical and programmatic accessibility, which are rooted in the WIOA law and the regulations. So the bottom line is that the physical and programmatic accessibility requirements apply to all service locations, regardless of whether designated as comprehensive one-stop centers, affiliate, or specialized centers or not, or if they're another type of access site, physical and programmatic accessibility requirements apply. That question came from the last webinar because in the MOU template it is specific to the designated centers of comprehensive one-stop centers or designated affiliate or specialized centers. While the MOU is specific to those designated centers, we all just affirm that the physical and programmatic accessibility requirements apply to all access locations. So that's just a clarification. This question relates to the provision in the governor's guidelines in the narrative and both repeated in the MOU template regarding acronyms and abbreviations that are not allowed in the MOU. This is simply a reaction responding to a requirement by the Office of the Illinois Comptroller. Because the MOU is used as a contract for payment in Illinois, the Comptroller's office can't process that payment if abbreviations and acronyms are used for any of the required partners. So that applies to two parts of the MOU specifically. One is to the very first section called Parties to the MOU, and another is in the signature portion of the MOU. No abbreviations or acronyms can be used in either of those locations. This is a common question about when are new signatures required. We all know that the MOU must obtain the signatures of every required partner and party to the MOU. That's required every time that you submit an MOU, a new MOU, signatures are required. Signatures are also required anytime the MOU is amended. All amendments to the MOU must obtain new signatures because often that might mean that the commitments of the partners have changed or the the way costs are shared or the way services are delivered. Anything that requires an amendment to the MOU requires new signatures. There are other times that after the state level review of your MOUs, so you turn in your MOUs by June 30th every year, June 30th, then the state goes through a review process from July to August and September, and then sends a letter to the local areas that says, the state has reviewed your MOU and one-stop operating budgets. Here are the changes that are required of you before we can approve it, and often those changes are technical in nature or just to ensure compliance. They typically do not change the actual commitments made by the required partners. That's what this screen and this question is about. So new signatures are not required when the state asks you to make technical changes to your MOU or your budget spreadsheet simply for compliance purposes so that the state can approve it officially. The way that it's handled is that a letter is provided in the Governor's Guidelines Revision 4. A template of the letter is on the right side of the screen. It's from the local board chair, and getting that local board chair's signature indicates to the state that all required partners agree with the required revisions that were made to the MOU or the budget spreadsheet. So if you have any questions about that, you're always welcome to contact the Interagency Technical Assistance Team, and we can guide you about when you need new signatures or not. You'll also expect, you can expect to receive guidance from the Technical Assistance Team leading up to all of the deadlines about when signatures are required. Okay, I'm going to pause just briefly, and again, as Scott said, you're welcome to type any questions in the question box, and Scott's going to help me make sure that I can see those. And I will respond to whatever I'm able to if you have any. And if not, then we will keep moving on. Scott, do we have any questions coming in?
We do have a question in the question box.
Okay.
And it's somewhat lengthy, so let me start that. We understood that a list would be provided by the state of the relevant state agency staff authorized to negotiate for the respective programs in each of the workforce areas. Can you give us some information on this and when such a list will be provided?
Yes, this is an item of discussion. The Interagency Technical Assistance Team is actually meeting this afternoon. We'll revisit this question and we'll be able to respond hopefully soon after about whether a list will be compiled and available to you all. Even if a list is not available, I'll repeat the advice that you're welcome to contact the Interagency Technical Assistance Team if you're having trouble identifying or contacting any of the required partners that you think need to participate in the MOUs, and we'll do the best we can to make sure that that person is identified and contacted so they're aware of the negotiation process.
Thank you. I have a question from Sherry. It says the low-income customers would be served at the DHS offices where they obtain benefits. Will customer focus groups be included?
Sherry, I'm not sure the basis of the question related to MOU negotiations for program year 2020. Is there any way to rephrase your question so I know how it relates to the PY 2020 negotiations, or is this about other planning activities?
Okay, in the meantime, I have another question. It says, does a letter for technical changes need to go to each required partner? By Kathy.
That when the state provides the letter listing the required revisions for the MOU template, it's advised that the partners are made aware of those required revisions, because when the local board chair submits that letter that was on the previous screen, that local board chair signature indicates that all the required partners are okay with the revisions made. So it is advised that you share the letter and the required revisions and the revised MOU with all the required partners, so they're aware of the revisions that were made, even if it's just for technical or compliance purposes.
I don't have any additional questions, and I've not heard anything back from Sherry.
Okay, thank you. We'll keep track of that question, Sherry. If we can answer it, we will. If not, we can always touch base offline to make sure that we have the context we need to answer the question. Okay, so the next portion of the webinar is simply recapping and highlighting some of the changes to the governor's guidelines narrative that were made. We presented these in the draft version to you in October, but we offer them as reminders today, mostly clarifications in an attempt to alleviate any confusion over the required content of the MOUs and the budget spreadsheets. So this first one relates to the referral methods that must be documented in the MOU according to the regulations. So it's nuanced, but an important change to the governor's guidelines narrative, and it relates to the identification of referral methods. Rather than saying the methods must encompass specific arrangements, it's clearer to say that the referral methods should actually spell out the customer's needs, the services that will meet those needs, and the communications protocol for tracking referrals between required partners. So that's just a clarification within the narrative of the governor's guidelines, and you'll see in a few slides how we handle that in the MOU template. This next revision to the actual narrative of the governor's guidelines, the actual guidelines themselves, and it pertains to the minimum FTE commitment, full-time equivalent commitment of 0.25 FTE. There is an option in the governor's guidelines of requesting a waiver if all the partners agree to allowing a partner to commit less than the 0.25 FTE. But the caveat is that even if a partner commits less than a 0.25 FTE, that partner still has to somehow ensure that its services and programs can be accessed during all regular business hours. So you know that the governor's guidelines require all partners to commit a minimum of a 0.25 FTE staff to provide services through either on-site staff, contractor staff, cross-trained staff, or off-site staff who are available by on-demand technology, or what is called direct linkage technology. So that waiver process was formalized in last year's guidance, and then said if all required partners and the local board chair agree that the partner can commit less than a 0.25 FTE, then the local board chair should submit a waiver request to the state. And the provision on the slide here today clarifies that process to emphasize that all required partners have to agree before the local board chair can request a waiver. And this also came up in various conversations about what is a 0.25 FTE, how does that convert to what a partner is actually committing. In one example, if a 40-hour work week were used for that particular program and that staffing, then that would equate to about 10 hours a week of a 0.25 FTE staff would equate about 10 hours a week in a 40-hour work week. That's just one example. There are many other ways to calculate that depending on your circumstances, but that's one example. So anything less than that 0.25 FTE commitment would require a waiver request from that provision of the governor's guidelines. This revision relates to when you need to submit an MOU amendment, as I mentioned. At least every year, you have to submit an amendment to append the annual one-stop operating budget. Because remember, the one-stop operating budget is an annual document. And annually, it has to be amended into the existing MOU. Because as you know, MOUs have a maximum term of 3 years. So every year that the MOU is amended to append the budget, then the MOU cover page is required. That MOU cover page is provided as a fillable form on the WIOA implementation portal. This is another example of a requirement by the Illinois Comptroller's Office so that it can continue to use the existing MOU as the contract for payment. And every year that the MOU is amended, the Comptroller's Office needs to say that the original MOU remains intact and these amendments are approved and part of that existing MOU. That's why every time you amend the MOU, you have to have you have to submit it with a cover page for the comptroller's office and all new required partner signatures. This section of the Governor's Guidelines narrative relates to special invoicing considerations which affect the invoicing for actual costs or your reconciliation of budgeted to actual costs at least twice a year. So the Governor's Guidelines had to build in a section about periodic reconciliation based on federal guidance that came out in a training, employment, and guidance letter in 2017, I believe. So previous supplemental guidance provided that in Illinois, you have to reconcile budgeted to actual costs at least every 6 months. Or if you charge your partners, invoice your partners as actual costs are incurred throughout the year, then that's okay because partners are paying actual instead of budgeted costs. Now what this item on the screen is talking about is the Community Services Block Grant Program has a different grant cycle than most required partners. So that in the past couple of years caused some issues regarding the timing of invoicing and reconciling budgeted to actual costs at June 30th every year because the grant cycle would close out and certain documentation and invoices had to be processed before that date. So the change on this slide and in the Governor's Guidelines narrative is to specify that any partner, well, we know CSBG's grant cycle requires payment by December 31st each year and by June 30 each year. So that has to be built into your MOUs and the plans for your frequency of invoicing. What's highlighted on the screen here in yellow is to say that if any required partner has a special invoicing deadline, then that needs to be known upfront and documented in the MOU from the beginning. That just helps build some predictability for all partners involved. It also stops short of requiring a certain frequency of invoice for all partners throughout the state. We don't think that would be realistic, and we know every local area and every program partner is different. So rather than requiring a certain frequency of invoicing, this is hopefully a compromise to say at least provide that timing in the MOU so that all partners are aware of it. This next revision relates to the glossary of the Governor that's included in Appendix B of the Governor's Guidelines. That appendix item has always been a glossary since the beginning of the Governor's Guidelines. There are just 2 new terms that have been drafted that are on the screen. The first is about service integration, and based on the service integration policy language, it is a combination of strategies to align and simplify access to one-stop center services and supports for employers, job seekers, and system customers, with the goal of providing the best experience possible. Service integration may occur across entities delivering specific services or programs, across time as customer needs change, or both. So that language, it's just important that in the MOU and in the Governor's Guidelines, service integration is a key word and a key principle of WIOA. And now this is acknowledging that this is what the definition is. The other definition that is new this year is the situational partner. Because based on federal guidance to Illinois, this definition has been used now, that program partners must make services available in comprehensive one-stop centers and share in the cost of maintaining the one-stop delivery system as agreed upon in the MOU when there is a designated provider of the program services in that local area. Otherwise, they're not required to be a party to the MOU in all 22 local areas throughout the state. So that's just adding because we know that situational partners, there's been questions in the past about what they are and when they have to be required parties to the MOU. So you can refer back to this glossary if you have questions about that. This is the last update for this section regarding the Governor's Guidelines narrative. This pertains to the state-level career service matrices that's included as Appendix F in the guidelines. And if you recall, the state-level version of the matrix is intended to be used as a resource for your local negotiations. It's just a resource. Required partners in each local area still have to fill out your own local career service matrices as part of your MOUs. But what's included in the Governor's Guidelines Revision 4 is the state level version, just to verify that state agency partners have reviewed the expectations of their programs and offer these expectations to about which career services should be offered in the local areas as applicable. So hopefully it's just a tool and a guideline to you for when you're starting to fill out your local career service matrices in your MOUs. I'll pause before I go on to the next section. Again, Scott, do we have any questions coming in the chat pod?
We do have a clarification from Sherry. I sent a note in your chat box, but I'm going to read you both. The low-income customers would be served at the DHS offices where they obtain benefits. Will customer focus groups be added? And then the follow-up. This refers to involving customer input into the services that customers would benefit. There is a need for customers to be included.
Is there, okay, thank you for the additional piece, Sherry. Is there anyone of the members of the technical assistance team that would have input into how to respond to that question? And if not, then Sherry, we'll do our best to get you a response in writing about how we can provide any guidance for that process. Is there anything else?
We did have a note. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I have a note regarding the CSBG grant cycle. Just to be in the present, the CSBG grant ends in a couple of weeks on December 31st. So if you've not already sent an invoice to your CSBG partner, or if you are the CSBG partner and have not yet received an invoice for the July to December 2019 services, then you should make connections and as soon as possible to make sure that those invoices are processed and able to fit within the current grant cycle for CSBG. That's just a reminder to you all. Thank you for that reminder, Mike Baker. Okay, then we'll continue on with the last couple of sections here of the webinar, specific to the MOU template. These were presented again in October in the draft version of the MOU template, but I highlight them again just so you can know that they remain intact in the final version that was issued last month. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see the red font. There is only one new section in the MOU template this year, and that is related to service integration. It's simply to document how the service integration action plan and strategies will be operationalized by the partners in the local area. So, and then service integration, again, that refined language, including the glossary definition, the refined language around service integration is incorporated throughout the MOU template, but there's really only one new section. All of the other sections of the MOU template are intact. There just are some changes for combining sections when they were similar. For example, the purpose of the MOU and the duration of the MOU in previous guidelines were separate in separate sections. We think it makes sense for them to be in the same section, so they were combined in the MOU template for program year 2020. Another example that often resulted in some required revisions or clarifications was related to the amendment procedures and the renewal provisions. Amendment procedures and renewal provisions are too similar to result in clear definitions of each, so we combined those and made the required section more streamlined and clear about what we needed in order to ensure it was compliant with the federal regulations about amendment procedures. And then there are some other changes that you see on the screen, including the checkboxes that some of which we've reviewed with you already in the webinar, and other just clarifications made throughout the document. So it's really not that much different hopefully any changes that were made make your life a little easier in the upcoming negotiations. And then this section 4 is the new part of the MOU template, the only new part regarding the service integration. And this is what it looks like. It's very simple. It says identify the steps that required partners will take within the term of this MOU to implement the strategies described in the Service Integration Action Plan. And then there is a link, that blue link up there in the heading of that section. Actually, if you click on it in the document, it takes you to the Service Integration Overview and Self-Assessment Guide so that you can see how to navigate this section. So the intent is not to be redundant to the Service Integration Action Plan, but to use the MOU to take it one step further to describe the commitments partners will make to actually implement the Service Integration Action Plan. Another revision in the very next section 5 of the MOU relates to the MOU development. And this is an example of how we tried to replace the general language in previous MOUs with more specific requirements so it's easier for you to know what you have to do to comply with them. So the example about the development of the MOU, rather than describe how the service locations were selected, this modified version says, describe the process of reviewing the draft and final commitments to service delivery, locations, and costs. What we really need to know out of this section is that all required partners were at the table and part of the conversation about the services and costs, and that all partners had chances to weigh in on the draft and final MOUs and budgets. That is going to be more explicitly helpful to making sure that all partners really participated in the negotiations than what was previously required in the past MOUs. This section is an example of how in the MOU template we tried to remove content that really wasn't value added to the MOU as an agreement between the partners. So for example, we removed the long paragraphs of text where you had to describe your career services that your program would offer, because that was redundant to the career service matrices that are at the end of your MOUs. So why have the narrative repeat what's already reflected in the career services matrices? So that narrative requirement was removed. It was replaced with what's on the screen for a description of how the FTE commitments for each partner will enable the customer to access services on demand during all regular business hours. So this is where you explain any cross-training or use of direct linkage technology or on-site staff or contractors, however you choose to do it, to ensure that any person who needs to access your services can do so during all regular business hours. And that is not redundant to the career service matrices. It's an addition to being very specific about how partners will actually make it happen. This is another example of a checkbox that's added new to the MOU template. And again, just to make sure that your MOUs have language that complies with the regulations, this time about physical accessibility. So by checking the box, all partners are affirming that they are affirming the language that's in the checkbox, that the one-stop system will comply with all federal and state physical, inclusive, and accessibility requirements. Just note that in the MOU template, you still have to describe the narrative, the specific features of your physical space and how partners will ensure all centers are physically accessible. It's just this box was redundant and repeated every single MOU, so we just decided to hopefully try to make it easier on you by checking that box to affirm that very specific regulation. This next change that was in the draft version and is still included in the final version is related to the section of the MOU template where each partner had to describe to which other partners it would refer customers. So This is a direct reaction to the common revision that required you to amend your MOUs or revise your MOUs to make sure that the MOU narrative aligned with the local service matrices. Because we know as things changed in the term of the MOU, things will get updated in one place and not the other, and then you will get dinged for not having them match, which that's not a good use of our time, and that's not putting you in a fair place of filling out an MOU. So this has changed, hopefully for the better. The MOU template now includes a referral system matrix, which I'll show you on the next slide. But in that matrix is where each partner checks a box to indicate which partners it will refer customers to. And then the MOU narrative is dedicated to describing the method of making referrals, the method of tracking referrals, and the role of the one-stop operator in that process. So hopefully it reduces the redundancy and instead is very meaningful in how referrals will work in your local area. And this is what the referral system matrix looks like. It replaces what was previously required in the MOU narrative section and hopefully makes it easier for you. This next revision to the MOU template relates to documenting how partners will share data and information. And the intent is to make it easier, again, by clicking two checkboxes specific to participant level data and the requirements of IDES to protect personally identifiable information and other partners, but just to make sure that the items that were required previously are now just checkboxes that you affirm those two items. And just note that still above in the right side of the screen, you still have to describe how partners will share the information and collaborate to ensure that the primary indicators of performance are met and outline service integration strategies to implement the strategies for simplifying service delivery and customer access to services. That's still required in the narrative, but these two particular check marks hopefully are just a little bit easier rather than having to fill out a paragraph. This last set of revisions to the MOU template are specific to MOU signatures. And again, coming from the Illinois Comptroller's Office, the 4 points on the screen speak for themselves. You have to spell out the names of the agencies, titles, and required partners. You cannot use abbreviations or acronyms in the MOU signature pages or on the parties to the MOU. Do not include with your submission any blank signature pages of partners not included as a party to the MOU in your local area. If you did that, then it just makes it look like you have a party to the MOU that didn't sign. So remove any blank pages of the signature pages that are not applicable in your area. And then when submitting the MOU amendments, all signature pages should immediately follow the cover page that's required for any time you amend the MOU. And you can, we know and anticipate sending out additional reminders and guidance before major deadlines of the MOU negotiation process about what's required for you to submit and any special instructions for that submittal. So know that you can expect to receive additional guidance throughout the program year and your negotiation period. But the one thing I'll also offer again is at the bottom of the screen here, there are additional signature pages that you can download anytime at the WIOA implementation portal at that link. So those are all the revisions. There are just a couple reminders about the process of state level review of your MOUs, and then I'll offer some additional reminders about other resources that can be helpful to you in the negotiation period and that are included in the governor's guidelines. So this first reminder is just that after MOUs and annual budgets are submitted to the state on June 30th every year, a state level review process occurs and really looks for completeness and compliance, and then anything that's specific to a program for required. And then required revisions are issued in the form of a letter and they're usually due within 30 calendar days. In the past couple of years, it's been by October 30th. Along with that letter from the board chair affirming that the required revisions have been accepted by all parties to the MOU. And that, again, that form letter is included for you to download and fill out and revise however you see fit for submitting those required revisions, and that letter from the local board chair. And just a reminder that public notice is not required when you make those required revisions that are technical in nature. But at all times, you're encouraged to make your MOU and any revisions available for public viewing. What's on the screen now are the list of all the forms. Again, the only new one is the local board revision response letter, a template. All other forms are not new, and they are located on the WIOA implementation portal at that link. So, and it's really advised that you go to the portal anytime you're ready to fill out the form, because you'll know that that is the most recent version, that's the active version. Try not to use ones that are just emailed to you in attachments, because if they were outdated for whatever reason, then you would waste your time filling out an outdated form. Go to the WIOA implementation portal to download all the active documents when you're ready to fill them out. The other resources in the governor's guidelines, there's a timeline that I'll show you on the next slide, but that timeline, if you ever have a question about what comes next and when the due dates are, that's included in the governor's guidelines, that document. The glossary that we mentioned the two new terms, but there are many other terms, including infrastructure funding and state funding mechanism and local funding mechanism, and all these items that are you've probably heard throughout the years. There are very clear definitions in the governor's guidelines, so please use that resource if that's helpful. There are also examples of shared costs. We know there are two categories of shared costs. There are some for infrastructure funding to fund the actual physical overhead of one-stop center. And then there are also additional costs that can be shared that are really more up to local discretion and less spelled out in the final regulations of WIOA. But there are examples of what those costs could entail if you need examples to support your negotiations or conversations with your partners. And then also there's an appendix item in the governor's guidelines that explains the requirements of you and of the state under the state funding mechanism for infrastructure funding and the local funding mechanism for infrastructure funding. And if you ever have questions about that, please let the technical assistance team know, but there are resources in the governor's guidelines that explain what those requirements are per partner and the implications that if impasse is reached about how the partners are going to share in the infrastructure funding for a one-stop center. If impasse is reached, what are the implications for you all and for the funding available under the state funding mechanism? And the short story is it's a much less pretty picture under the state funding mechanism. There's far more flexibility under the local funding mechanism, and we encourage you to ensure that all your partners reach agreement about how those costs will be shared, because in the long run, it's really better for you all as partners and for the customers of WIOA if you all agree and operate under the local funding mechanism. But we have much more content about that. If you need support for understanding the implications, we can provide that to you. This is a recap of the timeline, including the red arrows for due dates. This is the process that has kind of become formulaic in the past few years, at least, absent no additional federal guidance that was unanticipated. December is the time when you need to begin your planning your negotiations and gathering information and getting partners all on the same page in that pre-program year planning form that is due by January 1st. In January, it's best to start your negotiations then, because in April 15th, the negotiation period technically ends, and that's when you have to submit to the state a form that's available on the portal that is called the Report of Outcomes. You're reporting to the state in that form whether you all have reached agreement on the MOU and on your one-stop operating budget. And then also with that April 15th submittal of the report of outcomes, you submit a draft one-stop operating budget spreadsheet. And we understand that it could change after that date, but it's simply a way for us to understand the status of your negotiations, whether there are any challenges, and whether there's any issues that can be addressed before you run into any problems that could potentially put you at impasse of how you're going to share the costs and services. Then by May 1st, based on what you told us in your report of outcomes, at the state level, the technical assistance team then begins a remediation process with any areas that have not yet reached agreement about their MOU or the infrastructure funding requirements. Then that remediation period lasts for about 30 days. And the state also gives you feedback about your draft budgets to say if there were any issues that they identified or any questions that they had or any tips they can give you to make sure that your one-stop operating budget is compliant and complete. And then if remediation is not successful by May 31st and impasse is a risk, then there's a series of actions that have to happen. Remediation can continue if there's, we believe that there's a likelihood that agreement can be reached. It just needs a little bit more work. But in the end, by June 30th, if impasse is necessary, if the partners in a local area have reached impasse and simply cannot agree on a way to fund the infrastructure costs of the one-stop center, then the state funding mechanism is triggered, and any areas that have not reached agreement are reported to the federal government and the agencies that oversee their programs, and then the governor has to get involved and actually determine the amount that required partners are going to be required to commit to make sure that a budget is in place for that program year. And there's a lot more, again, about the consequences of triggering the state funding mechanism described in the governor's guidelines. And if there is ever a need for us to describe that to you, we will. Resources are available to support and to explain it further. So lastly, the action that's required of you now is that the governor's guidelines are out. They're not expected to change, but they are pending the governor's final approval. So please use the governor's guidelines as a tool to support your negotiations. Begin planning for those negotiations, contacting your partners, identifying those who have to be involved in negotiations, identifying the key people. Turn in that pre-program year planning form as soon as possible or by January 1st. Make sure the form is circulated to all the required partners so they're aware of what was submitted and they can put dates on their calendars if known. And then begin your negotiations as soon as possible in January. That's the advice and the guidelines issued in the governor's guidelines. Again, that's the end of the content that's planned for this webinar, but we are offering to answer any questions that you have about anything was presented or anything that you would need to get your pre-program, your planning form going. So I'll pause again and invite you to ask questions in the question box. And Scott, thanks for reading any questions that come aloud because I'm having a hard time viewing them on my screen.
Okay. We do have a question. If an area is negotiating a new MOU this year, not a revision, is the cover page, Appendix H, required?
No, very good question. Okay. The MOU cover page, amendment cover page is called the amendment cover page because that cover page is only required when you submit amendments. So you do not need to that MOU amendment cover page when you submit the new MOU by June 30th.
Okay. We also had a question about one of the links that was provided on page 28 of the presentation, and it linked to the overview and self-assessment guide. Okay. It doesn't appear to be an active link when we try and click on it.
When we turn it into a PDF, I'm sorry, that probably didn't protect the hyperlink. So we can try. Let's see. Is there a place, Scott, that you're able to copy and paste that into the chat box so that everyone can see it?
I can. It's just a narrative or description of the link. It doesn't actually identify the link.
Oh, I have
So
to
I don't
link.
have the link.
Okay, I have it. I'm sorry. It doesn't look like I'm able to post it to everybody.
If you want to.
Oh, here, I think I got it. Oh, no.
Okay.
Okay, we will, there we go. I think I sent it to all. Just know that in the governor's guidelines document that is available on the WIOA implementation portal, that link should be active in the actual governor's guidelines. Remember I said it was a hyperlink in the heading of that section? That hyperlink should be active in the document of the MOU template and in the governor's guidelines. So if you aren't able to get it through this webinar today, please know that it's available on that those two documents that are available on the WIOA implementation portal.
Okay, I do not have any other questions.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I do. Is there anything else different about the process for a new MOU in terms of the calendar, timeline, or actions required?
If you've been participating in the last couple years of MOU negotiations for amendments and annual budget negotiations, the timeline is not new. It's similar, it's on the screen, it's the same that was used in the past couple of years. The only difference, the new form last year, the pre-program year planning form was new last year and was due by December 31st. It's the same this year. So that's the only change. Otherwise, it's the same in terms of deadlines. It's the same.
Okay, that's all the questions that we've had presented to us.
I'll open it up to anyone else on the phone if you have any other questions or any of the other required partners of the technical assistance team. If you have anything else that you wanted to offer as pointers or know of questions that we need to address here, I'll pause and invite you to talk by phone. Okay, well, thank you for joining today's webinar. And if you have additional questions, please reach out to us and you're welcome, and we'll do our best to get you a response in writing and share the response with everyone if it would be beneficial to everyone about the MOU negotiations for PY 2020. Thank you very much, and we do wish you the best as you begin your negotiations and close out the year. Thank you. Scott, I think that concludes our webinar.
Thank you. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be posted on Illinois WorkNet as a resource in the next 48 hours. With that, I'll say thank you and have a great day.